seminar. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome everyone to this seminar from the Global Food and Environment Institute at the University of Leeds. My name is Professor Clare. I'm a professor of marine biogeochemistry in the School of Geography at the University of Leeds, and I am chairing today's session. So I'm going to briefly introduce myself, but mostly I'm going to focus on introducing our speaker for the day. So I am a professor in marine biogeochemistry with expertise mostly in the way that benthic biogeochemistry and particularly organic geochemistry interacts with seafloor ecosystems and the way that controls carbon cycling and storage in marine sediments. So I'm particularly interested in understanding the factors that control carbon storage and carbon burial in marine sediments, and these set of interests has brought me into contact with Caroline and her research. So current projects that I'm involved in include manipulative experiments to investigate the impact of things like ocean warming, microplastics on the way that seafloor ecological communities function and how they cycle carbon. I'm also interested in or moving into looking at how various human activities such as trawling impact carbon storage in sediments. And I'm also involved in environmental baseline and impact assessment work for proposed deep sea mining. But I'd like to move on to introducing Caroline for today. So it's my great pleasure to welcome to this webinar presenting to us today Professor Caroline Peacock from the School of Earth and Environment at the University of Leeds. And Caroline's talk title for today is Mineralogical Controls on Earth's Climate. So before we turn to the presentation, I'm just going to introduce Caroline's background to some extent. So Caroline is an experimental biogeochemist with a focus on application of fundamental chemical principles to understanding the cycling of key elements in the Earth system. So the cycling and interactions of different elements and minerals in the Earth system ultimately control the abundance, availability and distribution of those elements in the modern environment, but also in ancient environments. And that gives us, therefore, a detailed understanding of this gives us an ability to elucidate links between geological and chemical and biological components and to treat the Earth system as a whole. Caroline's group take a diverse set of approaches to research, and that includes laboratory experiments, both in terms of chemical experiments, but also microbiological experiments with cutting-edge synchrotron analytical techniques and advanced computational and geochemical modeling to really provide that kind of whole package of approaches to understand interactions between carbon with micro and macronutrients and minerals in sediments and soils. So Caroline's research track record has come from a more mineralogical background, looking at interactions of minerals such as bernesite with different trace elements and micronutrients in marine sediments. And this has evolved more recently to focusing particularly on interactions of organic carbon species with mineral surfaces, particularly iron oxyhydroxides. And that really places her at the forefront of what is really a renewed effort and new avenues of investigation as we continue to try and understand what processes control the storage and sequestration of carbon, both in marine sediments, which is certainly the angle that I come from, but also in soils. And one thing that I'd really like to highlight is that actually decades ago, wise people have been pointing out that we should be thinking about soils and marine sediments in similar terms. We should be borrowing each other's approaches. We should be learning from the two different fields. And Caroline is one of the people who has actually taken that point and run with it and is making those links between the way that soils function and the way that marine sediments function. So we're welcoming you today to the Global Food and Environment Institute webinar series. And so I'll just say a little bit about the GFEI. So the GFEI is an interdisciplinary research community which brings together members from across academia, across different disciplines, joining humanities and sciences, with also industry and public policy to work on the integrated challenges of food security and climate change. So further information about GFEI can be found at the website. So that's leeds.ac.uk/global food. And there are further seminars in this seminar series which are advertised on TicketSource. Okay, before I ask Caroline to begin her presentation, let's just cover the basics of seminar etiquette. Please, can you keep your cameras and microphones switched off during the seminar while Caroline is talking? Caroline's talk will take about 20 minutes. During this time, please feel free to use the chat function addressed to everyone with your questions. And at the end of the presentation, there will be a 10-minute question and answer session, and I'll collate questions from the chat in order to chair that. I'm just going to remind you that this seminar is being recorded and the recording will be made available via YouTube. Okay, so without further ado, I'd like to say over to you, Caroline. We'd love to hear your talk.
Hi, okay, thank you very much. Let me just make sure I get the right slide up. I'm sorry I've put this slide up when you were talking, Claire, I completely forgot about it. But here we go. Okay, so thank you, Claire, for chairing and for your kind introduction. And thank you to the organisers for inviting me to speak at this webinar today. And for the audience for tuning in. I hope you find this topic of interest. And I'd like to thank and give credit to my collaborators, a large group of people who've worked with me over the past few years on the research that I'm going to present. And obviously to thank my research support and funding that I will highlight again at the end before questions. So, okay, how can minerals help control Earth's climate? Well, firstly, through mineral weathering, which removes carbon from the atmosphere, and mineral breakdown, which then returns carbon back to the atmosphere. And this cycle is usually referred to as the inorganic carbon cycle. But secondly, minerals can help control Earth's climate through helping to preserve and bury organic carbon that is produced during primary productivity. And this, again, removes carbon from the atmosphere, burying carbon into marine sediments usually, and then eventually returning it back to the atmosphere. And this process is usually referred to as the organic carbon cycle. And it's this latter role of minerals in helping to preserve and bury organic carbon that I'm going to focus on today. But first, I'd like to step back a little and provide some background to our understanding of what controls the preservation and burial of organic carbon. Despite the obvious importance of organic carbon cycling, and as alluded to by Claire, even after many years of research, we still don't fully understand what controls whether organic carbon is preserved and buried or degraded. Ultimately, the gatekeepers to whether organic carbon persists in the environment are microbes. And that's because once organic carbon is produced during photosynthesis, microbes start to break it down during respiration. But basic biopolymers are extremely edible, if you like, and even relatively tough, chewy carbon like plant and microbial components. These are essentially labile under the right microbial conditions. So in truth, one might argue that all organic carbon should be degraded and returned to the atmosphere eventually. And the fact that any is locked away from the atmosphere is actually profoundly puzzling. It implies that one or more factors are needed to actually circumvent microbial respiration and allow just enough organic carbon preservation to regulate climate to within habitable bounds. Now, these factors can be defined and discussed in many ways, but they've traditionally been concerned with intrinsic factors that are specific to the organic carbon, for example, like the organic carbon source type, the organic carbon composition, its source flux, and then extrinsic factors. And these are specific to the surrounding environment, for example, like the water column oxygen concentration or the sediment oxygen concentration, which is a factor itself of the bottom water oxygen concentration, the sedimentation rate, the sediment permeability, sediment mixing and ventilation, and a variety of other factors. And these latter factors in the extrinsic category largely boil down to something that we refer to as oxygen exposure time. So the longer organic carbon is exposed to oxygen, the more it will be degraded. But exemplified by the marine environment very well, despite some often quite striking empirical correlations between organic carbon preservation and one or more of these different factors at specific study sites, their global correlations are actually very weak. And in particular, if we take two of the more commonly used factors in marine sediment oxygen concentration and sediment accumulation rate, and we map these against the amount of organic carbon preserved in marine sediments, we see that on the continental shelves, where over 90% of all global organic carbon burial actually happens, there's in fact almost no relationship between these factors and organic carbon at all. And so with this in mind, there's general agreement that more mechanistic factors are required to fully explain organic carbon preservation. And a leading frontrunner for many years has been the preservation of organic carbon by minerals. And in the simplest sense, this is because of the sorption of dissolved organic carbon, or DOC, by fine-grained reactive mineral phases. And this process is suggested to protect organic carbon from degradation because the sorbed organic carbon is removed from the dissolved pool and is therefore less accessible to microbial attack. Oops, wrong way. And whilst this is a long-standing idea, largely stemming from observations of a global correlation between mineral surface area and organic carbon repositories in marine sediments, it's actually only relatively recently that minerals, and in particular iron oxyhydroxide minerals, are recognized as globally important repositories of carbon. And these repositories, recently referred to as a rusty sink, are thought to protect organic carbon from degradation over thousands to hundreds of thousands of years. But crucially, for sorptive protection to work as a preservation mechanism, the organic carbon must be relatively strongly sorbed so that it's not rapidly desorbed back into the more degradable pool. And in addition to sorptive protection, the mineral microbe carbon interface is extremely dynamic. And so it's also possible that in this environment, the organic carbon can undergo transformation, so a chemical transformation into a less degradable form. And we know, for example, that the manganese oxide mineral bernasite that Claire mentioned in her introduction is able to transform low molecular weight organic carbon into high molecular weight organic carbon via a type of polymerization reaction. So what minerals and what types of carbon are we most interested in for these sorptive protection and sorptive transformation processes? Well, my group works mainly with iron minerals and manganese minerals, so the iron oxyhydroxides and the manganese oxides. And that's because these minerals are ubiquitous in soils and sediments and natural waters. They're extremely reactive, and their cycling is known to be tightly coupled to organic carbon. And in particular, what types of organic carbon? Well, it's the carboxyl-rich component of organic carbon that their cycling is particularly coupled to. And in fact, this carboxyl-rich component is often enriched in the mineral fraction. And it's been suggested more recently that it's this carboxyl-rich fraction that might indeed be persistent over long timescales. So there's evidence, for example, now that this carboxyl-rich fraction is part, at least, of the persistent dissolved organic carbon pool in seawater. It's suggested again that the persistent carbon in all sorts of environments has a universal carboxylic signature. It's again suggested that the carboxyl-rich carbon might be prerequisite indeed for mineral preservation. And most recently, it is also suggested that the carboxyl-rich component is fundamental to colloid formation and stability in marine water columns. So my group, we do laboratory experiments, as Claire mentioned, to investigate these two pathways to preservation. So that's this sorptive protection and this sorptive transformation. And we do experiments with carboxyl-rich carbon and iron oxyhydroxides to investigate sorptive protection. And then we do experiments with carboxyl and with amino-rich carbon and iron oxyhydroxides to investigate sorptive transformation. And we perform these experiments under controlled conditions at different scales relative to the mineral microcarbon interface. So we look at things from molecular level, from organo-organo and organo-mineral interactions through to aggregate level, so up to macro aggregation, including the formation and destruction and thus the stability of these aggregates. And overarchingly, in our sorptive protection experiments, we find that carboxyl-rich carbon is more readily sorbed. The carboxyl-rich carbon is less readily desorbed, and this carbon is less readily oxidized, such that this carboxyl-rich carbon is actually protected from remineralization. And so we see that carboxyl component plays a really important role in the sorption and preservation of organic carbon. And in our sorptive transformation experiments, we find that low molecular weight carboxyl and amino-rich carbon can be chemically transformed into high molecular weight polymers by reactive forms of iron and manganese. And this is through an autocatalytic reaction that involves iron and manganese minerals as reaction centers. And this sorptive protection and sorptive transformation can compete with microbial remineralization, such that the polymerized carbon is again protected from remineralization. And fundamental to this polymerization and protection process, again, is the carboxyl component playing that really important role in sorption and preservation of organic carbon. So to try and unify the important control that minerals have on organic carbon cycling, we've recently proposed the mineral carbon pump. And this is a concept where the sorptive protection and the sorptive transformation by minerals pumps carbon from a labile, or in other words, a less reactive, to a recalcitrant, excuse me, from a labile, i.e. a more reactive, to a recalcitrant, i.e. a less reactive form. So here in a soil environment, exemplified by a soil environment here, we have root exudates, for example, which are processed microbially to produce a labile soil carbon pool, which then interacts with minerals through the mineral carbon pump, via processes like sorption and polymerization that I've talked about, but also including occlusion and aggregation at those larger scales that we investigate, and catalytic redox reactions to go from a labile form to a more stable recalcitrant or less reactive form. And we propose this process happens in soils, as per this recent publication, but also in sediments and waters, really anywhere that we have carboxyl-rich organic carbon and these iron and manganese oxyhydroxide minerals. And so potentially this could be a ubiquitous carbon preservation process. So how might the mineral carbon pump help to control the Earth system? Well, the preservation and burial of organic carbon features in several key components of the organic carbon cycle, and thus, of course, the overarching carbon cycle. So most notably, organic carbon preservation and burial is fundamental for carbon storage in terrestrial soils. And these store, according to one of the latest carbon budgets, these store approximately 1,700 gigatons of carbon. And also it's fundamental to the storage of carbon in marine surface sediments, which also store around 1,750 gigatons of carbon. So these are commensurate processes storing carbon in two separate components of the Earth system, potentially via the same process. So the first environment where the pump is likely to therefore be important is in soils. Now, soils store organic carbon over decades to centuries, and thus play a critical role in locking carbon away from the atmosphere over these relatively short timescales, short being on a geological time frame. So this in turn helps to regulate short-term climate. And soil organic carbon, of course, also plays a vital role in soil health and fertility, and soil water holding capacity, for example. And so by understanding the mechanisms by which soils preserve and store organic carbon, we can potentially help limit modern climate change and improve a whole host of soil ecosystem functions. So our work suggests that by increasing the proportion and/or the amount of carboxyl-rich organic carbon in soils, together with increasing the availability of reactive iron, we might encourage absorptive protection and absorptive transformation, and thus enhance soil organic carbon storage. So root exudates, for example, are a critical component of the soil ecosystem, and they are released from roots into the rhizosphere, and they contain a whole host of different sorts of organic carbon in different types of compounds. But most notably, particularly some species of plants are very organic acid rich, and it's these organic acids that are carboxyl carriers. These particularly contain a lot of carboxyl rich functional groups. So potentially by encouraging the production of organic acids in soils, and in turn with an increase in the amount of reactive forms of iron, one might encourage absorptive protection and absorptive transformation. And of course, then the second environment where this pump is likely to be important is in sediments, in marine sediments. And sediments store organic carbon over multi-millennia. And so they play a critical role in locking carbon away from the atmosphere over much longer timescales. And this is a critical component of regulating our long-term climate. And also, organic carbon preservation in sediments frees up oxygen that would have otherwise been used in its degradation. So this in turn helps regulate the long-term oxygenation of the oceans and atmosphere. So by understanding the mechanisms by which sediments preserve and bury organic carbon, we can help determine what controls climate and oxygenation over Earth history, and thus the processes that have helped create and maintain a habitable planet, both on Earth and potentially elsewhere in the universe. And in particular, Transitional periods in Earth history might pointedly exemplify the critical role of the mineral carbon pump in the Earth system. And that's because these periods are likely to have experienced changes in iron availability, and hence potentially changes in the availability of the iron minerals that we've shown to be important for carbon preservation and burial. So for example, excuse me, back one. So for example, the Great Oxidation Event, or the GOE, nearly 2.5 billion years ago, and latter oxygenation events represent major transitional periods in Earth history. These were when the planet first developed an oxygenated atmosphere and then subsequently reached oxygen levels near the present day, which of course now support complex intelligent life. And approximately commensurate with these transitional periods, geological and geochemical evidence indicates there was an increase in the land area, my pointer, increase in the land area and or the elevation of that land area, which should have led to an increase in the continental weathering of iron and other elements, and thus an increase in iron availability and those other elements in the oceans. Now, we can track this iron and its effect on organic carbon preservation and burial using a biogeochemical model, where as iron availability increases, organic carbon preservation and burial increases due to the mineral carbon pump. So as expected, we see that when iron availability increases, we increase the mineral carbon pump and thus the amount of organic carbon that is preserved and buried with iron minerals. And also we see that the mineral carbon pump is amplified under low phosphorus conditions, because with less of the nutrient phosphorus, there is less organic carbon production, but with the same amount of iron, then proportionally more of that organic carbon is preserved and buried. Then for oxygen levels in the deep oceans, this results in two important outcomes. In agreement with previous work, under high phosphorus, oxygen is high, because with more phosphorus, there is more organic carbon production and thus a higher preservation and burial flux. But under low phosphorus, we can also generate relatively high oxygen. And that's because we don't necessarily need more phosphorus to result in more organic carbon preservation and burial. Rather, we can independently control preservation and burial and thus oxygen via iron availability. So here where phosphorus is low, but iron is high, we still generate relatively high oxygen. So we believe that these preliminary tests of the role of the mineral carbon pump in the Earth system are really important, because they imply that the mineral carbon pump can decouple organic carbon production from organic carbon burial, such that one might imagine a scenario where organic carbon production stays constant or even decreases, but iron availability in the soils and sediments increases, and so organic carbon preservation and burial increases. So the take-home message of this talk, in its broadest sense, is that carboxyl-rich organic carbon and iron minerals can increase organic carbon storage in soils and organic carbon preservation and burial in sediments, and thus play a critical role in the Earth system. And moving forward, I think the duality of iron and manganese availability is really interesting, because on the one hand, they act in the surface ocean as nutrients that stimulate organic carbon production and eventually organic carbon burial. They also act in the deep ocean and the sediments as mineral hosts that promote carbon preservation and burial. But on the other hand, they act as terminal electron acceptors that facilitate carbon degradation. not to mention the fact that they act as scavengers of a whole host of other trace metals that are essential for organic carbon production. So I feel that the challenge really is trying to constrain these processes and their interplay and understand how they may have shaped the Earth system in the past, and perhaps even how we might use them to work better with the Earth system in the future. And so with that, I'd like to acknowledge and to thank my research team and collaborators again, to acknowledge my research support at the University of Leeds, and particularly at the Diamond Light Source, which is the UK's national synchrotron facility, and also acknowledge my research funding from the European Research Council, the Diamond Light Source, the Royal Society, and the Leverhulme Trust. And I'd be very happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Caroline. That was a fascinating talk, and great to have that kind of summary and see the key take-home messages, which are really new advances in the field. People are encouraged to ask questions. I see we have one person with their hand up. Is that a question that you would like to ask, please? I don't know if that was a slip of the mouse, perhaps. I think while we and I'd encourage everyone to post questions in the chat if you have questions that you would like to ask Caroline. In the meantime, Caroline, I've got difficult questions that I've prepared especially for you. I would. Oh, hang on, we do have a new message here, so we'd perhaps. It'd be better if I prioritize questions from the floor, actually. Okay, so I'm going to ask my question first while I just get my head around the question that's been put in the chat. So I'm interested, having kind of launched or mentioned in my introduction, your work that spans both soils and marine sediments, so terrestrial soils and marine sediments, and noting that this is something that people in this field have been saying we should do for a long time. We should, use similar approaches, learn from each other. I would be, and you're one of the only people who's actually doing that. I'd be interested in your views on, do you feel that you see real similarities in processes between soils and marine sediments? And are there any particular challenges to kind of unifying our understanding between those two different settings?
That's a great question, Claire. Thank you. I do see similarities, and that is partly because I work at a very small scale, and also partly because we haven't finished what we're doing, and ultimately plants are the major difference between marine sediments and soils, and plants are very complex and difficult to predict in natural soil environments. But going back to the first part of your question, when you work at the molecular level, like I do in the diagram that I showed across those scales that I work, from organomineral interactions through to sort of macro aggregation, ultimately we're dealing with a set of chemical components, i.e. the iron and manganese minerals, and the different forms or moieties of organic carbon, the different molecules of organic carbon. And really, at that level, the only difference between marine sediments and soils is the composition of the pore water. So marine sediments are obviously salty, and they contain an excess of certain ions in solution that pore waters don't. Pore waters are obviously a lot less salty and contain different types of ions. And these background electrolytes, as they're often called in my field, can have an important influence on the way that species interact with minerals. But in the case of organic carbon, and particularly in the case of carboxyl-rich organic carbon, the specific mode of interaction between the carbon and the mineral is independent of the background electrolyte concentration. And that's because it occurs via a process called carboxyl ligand exchange. And this is a very strong absorption mechanism that, as I say, is mostly independent of the background electrolyte. So when we look at the processes by which minerals and carbon interact in these two quite different environments at the macroscopic scale, they're actually very similar at the microscopic scale. As you start to broaden your gaze and come from the molecular level to, for example, field level, then yes, sediments and soils can be quite different, but ultimately the processes at a fundamental level that are controlling the carbon cycling are very similar between sediments and soils.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Caroline. And I think you've probably just given a verbal abstract for what should be an updated review paper. I think the field would benefit. Okay, I have another couple of questions in the chat. I'm going to take one from Li Zhenkung. So thank you very much. Who has asked, does manganese mineral contribute to the absorption of organic carbon?
Yes, thank you for the question. Yes, it does. I focused mainly on iron oxides today because I kind of fell into the general trope that iron oxides are more important than manganese oxides. I would like to make the point in this discussion that they aren't. They're of equal importance, if not perhaps of lesser importance than manganese oxides. Iron oxides tend to get advertised in this field, I think, a little bit more than manganese oxides because they're more prevalent in soils and sediments. So there's generally between 10 to 100 times more iron oxide present in soil than there is manganese oxide. But that's not to say that manganese oxides are not important. In fact, they may be disproportionately important because manganese oxides are more readily cycled in soils. So also, particularly in sediments, actually. So ultimately in sediments, once you reach a certain level of oxygen decline or anoxia, as we call it, and in fact euxenia, then iron oxides are basically transformed into sulfurous forms, and they form minerals like makinowite and eventually pyrite. And at that point, they are potentially less reactive towards organic carbon, although that has yet to be established, but they could potentially be less reactive towards organic carbon. Manganese oxides, on the other hand, don't have a sulfurous end member, so they aren't transformed typically into sulfide minerals. And so they stay reactive and they stay cycling in marine sediments for potentially a lot longer than iron minerals do. So whilst there's a lot less manganese oxides, they may actually be disproportionately important in trace element and mineral carbon cycling. So yes, the answer is very much so. Manganese oxides are extremely important for carbon preservation and burial.
Thank you very much, Caroline. I've got my eye on the time a little bit. I'm going to take one more question. So just to let people know kind of how I'm selecting questions from the chat at the moment. There are a couple of questions about emissions from food production, which I'm not going to direct to Caroline because I don't think that's necessarily her area of expertise, but I would ask GFEI colleagues if you might perhaps pick up those questions with the people who have asked them. I'm going to finish with one question from Jinghao Peng from Sun Yat-sen University, who has asked, who has observed that both organic carbon and organic phosphorus can be well preserved in sediments with a high sedimentation rate, such that the ratio of carbon to phosphorus is similar to the Redfield ratio. And they would like to ask whether you think organic phosphorus is more easily degraded than organic carbon in deep sea sediments with a low deposition rate. And can organic phosphorus contribute to the preservation of organic carbon?
That's a fantastic question. And it's something that myself and my colleague Simon Poulton have been talking about a lot recently. And my take on this is, at the moment at least, is that I think that there is a decoupling between carbon and phosphorus in organic matter, because ultimately today we've been talking about organic carbon, but really in the environment, organic carbon does not exist in isolation. It exists as part of an organic matter molecule, and that molecule will typically include phosphorus and sulfur and nitrogen and oxygen and the other elements like that. And I think what's happening in these environments, particularly in these low sedimentation rate environments, i.e. environments that are oxygen rich, is that microbial respiration is favorable, because aerobic oxidation is usually much more energetically favorable than anaerobic oxidation. So these organic molecules are being degraded, but I think it's the carbon and particularly the carboxyl rich part of the molecule that is actually attached and tethered, if you like, to the mineral surface. And this leaves the other moieties like phosphorus and potentially sulfur and nitrogen exposed to the bulk solution. And it could be that whilst the whole molecule is attached to the mineral surface, it's actually only the carbon that's strongly attached, and the other parts of the molecule are more exposed and more accessible to microbial respiration. And so you can find, I think, that the carbon in that molecule will be better preserved than the phosphorus. And so you will end up with a situation whereby you're almost chemically fractionating the organic matter, because some parts of the organic matter are absorbed strongly to the surface while others are not. I think that's as much as I probably can say on that at the moment, but it's something we're very much thinking about. So if I'd be very happy to talk via email on that.
Thank you very much, Caroline. And given the time, I'm going to draw our webinar to a close for today. So it just remains for me to thank Caroline for her talk and for answering questions today. And thank you to the Global Food and Environment Institute for hosting this webinar, and to everyone who has attended and asked their very interesting questions. So thank you very much and goodbye.